Ever since I can remember, I have had a very small and inexpensive reproduction, like plastic reproduction, of a painting by Warner Salmon titled Christ at Heart's Door. I'm sure you've all seen it at one time or another. It has, it's Jesus standing by this wooden door, about ready to knock, with lots of trees and shrubbery and such around. When I was little, I loved it. I knew Jesus was knocking at the door of my heart. When I got older and thought that I knew more, had more wisdom, this painting took on, started to signify aspects of Christianity that I was not so proud of. I didn't like the representation of Jesus as being so Anglo, nearly blonde hair. I could tell you all the things that were wrong with this painting, all the different ways that we had made God into our image, rather than seeking out the ways that we have been made into God's image. And then when I began seminary and I moved into a 9-by-12 room, this little plastic painting was one of the few things that I brought with me. It meant something new to me. I recognized Jesus was still knocking on the door of my heart. I had turned away from that knock, but now, years and much life experience later, I had returned. And of course, Jesus still looks very Anglo. He still has that blonde hair, and it's a very inaccurate representation. And of course, this little painting has been sold lots, and for less than holy reasons, I'm sure. But there's something about it, something about that knock on the door, and knowing that it was a knock on the door of my heart that made the difference. I'm speaking here of the Christian notion of call. We are all called, by virtue of our baptism, into a unique relationship with God, and a unique journey of living out that relationship with God in the world which we inhabit. Sometimes call comes quickly for us, and sometimes it takes a long time to figure out what that call is. In the reading from Samuel today, we hear one type of call from God, the call that comes in the middle of the night, quite by surprise. Samuel thinks it's Eli calling him, and it takes both Samuel and Eli some time to figure out that it's really God calling. Then in the gospel, we hear the call of the disciples. Philip comes right away, but Nathanael is a little more skeptical. He questions Philip and says, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" Nazareth in those days was the bad part of town, or the wrong side of the tracks. It was not the place to be from. Then Jesus sees Nathanael and says, "Here is an Israelite in whom there is no deceit." Jesus knew Nathanael's honesty and skepticism, and that being known by Jesus was what transforms Nathanael's heart. And he saw, meaning not to see with his eyes, but to see with his heart, who Jesus was. Nathanael no longer saw a man like any other man from Nazareth, but the embodiment, the incarnation of God in Jesus. Some of us answer our call like Samuel. God calls in the dark nights of our lives, and we respond with, "Here I am." We are ready to step up and move forward. Some of us answer our call like Philip, who knew right away and with such clarity who Jesus was. And some of us are like Nathanael. There may be no guile in us. We may be very honest about our skepticism, but it takes us a while to see and to understand what is happening. It takes God first knowing us before we can know God ourselves. I think a lot of Episcopalians are like Nathanael. We're skeptical, but we're honest about it. We come to church, we're good people, we give of ourselves, our time, our unique gifts, our money, and then we find our faith is still empty. We find ways to comfort ourselves and justify this emptiness by making excuses. I'm not being fed by this church. Church is boring. I don't like the music. I'm too busy. My husband and or my wife or my partner isn't into church. There are too many other competing interests. I'm not a church person. I like to have balance in my life. Or perhaps our justifications are a little bit more sophisticated and educated. I can't possibly get into a religion that is exclusive. I don't believe everything in the creed, so I must not be Christian. I'm not an evangelical, so I must not be a Christian. What is the virgin birth anyway? This religion is too violent, too patriarchal, too sexist, etc., etc. I think none of the above reasons matter to God. I don't think God is interested in the sophisticated ways that we decide whether or not we believe, nor do I think God is interested in our busy schedules or our desires to control our own lives by finding balance. I think God is interested in us, in our insides, in our hearts, in our intentions, in the ways that we live our life, each and every one of us, personally. The psalmist today speaks beautifully of the intimacy of God's knowledge of us. Lord, you have searched me out and known me. This is God searching us out. You know my sitting down and my rising up. You discern my thoughts from afar. You trace my journeys and my resting places, and are acquainted with all my ways. Indeed, there is not a word on my lips, but you, O Lord, know it altogether. For you yourself created my inmost parts. You knit me together in my mother's womb. There is nothing in us, not one thought, not one atom of light and energy, not one feeling of joy or sadness, hope or despair, that God, our loving God, does not already know and understand. When we ignore our call by God, just like when I set aside this little painting as no longer relevant, we ignore a deep part of ourselves. God lives in us. Or maybe a better way of saying it is, as Paul said to the Athenians, in God we live and move and have our being. The fundamental nature of call is incarnational. It requires this presence of God inside us and our presence inside of God. The fundamental nature of call is also relational. It comes first from God knowing us inside and out from start to finish, and loving us all the more. The call also requires a response from us. It may take time, or it may happen right away, but our spiritual journey requires our saying yes. Our yes to being known by God, our yes to being in a relationship with God, and our yes to answering God's call to us. In what ways are you being called by God? And are you able to say yes to that call?